Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Quilt National 2025, which is produced and circulated by the Dairy Barn Arts Center in Athens, Ohio. Today, we are thrilled to welcome and present the artist Chris Mercerhill. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so please feel free to utilize the chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we are presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation in bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thank you in advance for bearing with us. Hopefully that doesn't happen today, but you never know when we're online together. So without further ado, that's it. Let's welcome Chris Mercerhill for our talk today.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate it. It's good to see you, even though in Zoom I can't really see you, but I feel you. I know you're here, and it's great to be here. My name is Chris Mercerhill. Before I get started, I do want to thank Justin and Panahiota and Kat and the whole Rife team for inviting me, and Margaret Wunderlich as well from Chaos Contemporary Craft, who helped connect us all and helped put everything together today. So I'm thrilled to be able to share sort of my artistic journey with you, sort of where I started, where I came from, and where I'm going, I guess. Um, let's get started. I started at the, I guess my training was from the Art and Art History program, which is a really fantastic program, a joint program between the University of Toronto and Sheridan College in Oakville. The campus I went to was in Oakville. And it was a really fantastic program because I got to the art history at the university and the studio practice in the college. I got 2 degrees and really was the best of both worlds. It was really fantastic. The program's still going strong today, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested. I started out as a painter. Here's one of my paintings. On the right, you can see it's of a fingerprint or a thumbprint. I don't remember exactly. AI will probably tell me at some point. Um, and I started as a painter, and I think you'll see some of the things with my early paintings continue through most of the art I continue to make today. Playfulness, color, pattern, and part of my training was in questioning sort of every choice you make along the way. I believe choices have to have meaning. I'm a real problem solver, I think is how I would describe my approach. After 2.5 years of painting, where it was prompts, here, do a landscape, here, do some contrast, here, do this. They stopped giving us prompts, and I was sort of lost for a while. And I really struggled with, like, well, what do I do now? Give me a problem to solve. And they wouldn't, and it was frustrating. But one thing I learned, which continues to my practice today, is I just need to make stuff and then look back and see the common threads. I don't really say I'm gonna make this kind of art. I make art, I look back and I go, oh, I make that kind of art. And I make lots of different kinds of art. I explore lots of media. It all kind of goes in parallel with quilting or ties into quilting or informs my quilting, um, which is going to be sort of the focus today, but I'm going to sort of talk about a number of different things. When I was in the art and art history program, actually, let me share one more painting here. So here's another painting with some pattern. There's a pattern from, there's some maps, which I like sort of how maps go together, like information. On the left side is a strip of, that's sort of the counterfeiting countermeasures of an old Canadian $2 bill. And the top right corner is the interior of a school bus. And I sort of was connecting how these $2 trips back and forth from Sheridan to the U of T were working. If you don't see the school bus, if you turn upside down, the bottom left corner, maybe it's easier to see the little fans in the driver's seat. Anyway, so I was sort of looking around for things to do and inform my practice. And I stumbled across this book in the Sheridan College Library called 500 Quilt Blocks. And I was really fascinated. I always liked the geometry, but to find out these geometric patterns of squares and triangles and combinations had histories and meaning and sort of backgrounds and ties that you could explore, I found fascinating. And I really embraced that. Unfortunately, I didn't feel like I had a lot of old fabric. For me, quilting is a way to reuse unwanted fabric. You know, the sort of the classic idea of you wear through the shirt, you get a hole, you cut up the fabric that you can use instead of throwing the whole thing away, which I've always really liked. But when I was in college, I didn't really have generations old, or I hadn't really worn through any clothes, or I didn't feel like I had any fabric with meaning and story. So instead, what I started doing was I started taking pictures. And instead of cutting up fabric and sewing it together, I cut up photos and sewed it together. So here you can see this was a walk around my neighborhood when I lived in Illinois. And I took pictures during the fall of the trees, and then I cut them into this maple leaf shape and sewed those together. And so the pattern, this leaf pattern, which I think is a really beautiful geometric pattern, it's sort of a square with little triangles that bite out and sort of tessellate with each other. That sort of informed the subject of the photo. And to me, that made a lot of sense, making what I call photo quilts, um, taking the meaning or the subject matter of the block and combining that with the meaning or the subject matter of the image that I used. Another example. My family moved to Ohio, which is where my partner is from, and I knew of this block called the Ohio Star, which is on the left side there. And so it's these five. It's a 9 patch. It's a 3 by 3 grid, and four of the blocks are sort of these diagonal. They're crisscrossing diagonals. And so often when it's made with fabric, there's a dark and a light for contrast. When I was making this block into photo quilts, instead of dark and light contrast, I would use an image and its mirror. And so every time it met the border, instead of the contrast between light and dark, it would be a mirror image. And so you can sort of see how this block, this shape mirrors into this block. Now this is a big X block. So if you go, so that's four little pieces all mirrored, then it flips down to the center and it mirrors and so on. And you get these really interesting patterns and shapes. So here my subject was the locale or where I was in Ohio, and I used the Ohio Star to represent places that I loved in Ohio. So here's an example of what it looks like with the full quilt. On the left, this quilt is 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. I wanted my photo quilts to have a really human and traditionally quilt size scale. Plus, I was using 4 by 6 photo prints, and so 4 by 6 sort of made a lot of sense. Another thing I did, I used squares of the photos, and I'd use sort of slightly different parts of the photo. So you can see on the top, there's more sky, and on the bottom, there's more of this black structure. This is from the Park of Roses in Clintonville, in Columbus, Ohio. If you've ever been there, there's a really nice structure, and I took a picture around dusk. I was there with one of my kids, and I really like the silhouette and the shapes. And then when they combine and sort of what in these kaleidoscopic ways, it made a really intriguing pattern. This is another Ohio Star photo quilt I made at the North Market. So if you're familiar with the North Market, I believe, well, the white strips are sort of the ground floor and the floor above. There are these, I don't know, iron structural members, and I like the angles. And so again, it's the Ohio Star with the reversals that create this kind of kaleidoscopic effect. So I did sort of a series of these. I did a number of these, and they were fantastic. But I also wanted to explore other quilt patterns. And one of the ones I did on the left is a pattern called Chinese coins. So you can see these little strips. Those are actually strips of photographs. I fed them through a paper shredder, took the little strips, fed them out. So this quilt pattern called Chinese coins, similar to this, you'll see variations, but essentially it's these little stacked strips of stacked coins. So again, the meaning of the images and the quilt block tied in with this one because I went onto a website called Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where you can hire people. It's like a gig economy, Fiverr or TaskRabbit or whatever. And I paid people to take pictures of their hands and send them to me. And I paid them a living wage, which was about $20 an hour, which is living wage in Columbus, Ohio at the time, which I felt was really important because many of these gigs don't pay a living wage. Now, it was only about a 3-minute job. But anyways, I hired these online workers to send me pictures of their hands. And it's sort of a reflection, and there's such beautiful and brilliant variety, face down, face up, palm down, palm up, left, right, photo, landscape. And I sort of organize them dark to light, but I think it's a really beautiful, it's such a personal thing and a beautiful thing that I hired people to share with me. But I was also reflecting a lot on, hand making my photo quilts. But I make them with a sewing machine. So it's sort of not handmade, but it is handmade. And these are people from around the world that the internet brought to me to do this very traditional physical task of sewing into a quilt. So there's a lot of things sort of thinking about the internet economy sort of tied up into this piece, which I really enjoyed. On the right, there it is at the Ohio State Fair with one of my other Ohio Star quilts, and you can see those kaleidoscopic patterns emerging there. Another photo quilt I did, I think this is the last one I'm going to share, is a self-portrait. Again, it's about 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall. And this is made up on the right. You can see a close-up. This, I asked my Facebook friends if I could use their profile photos. And so I cut those up. I used software to um, take the collection of their portrait, what are they called? Profile photos, and make an image of me. And then I cut them all up and sewed them all together. It's thousands. I think it's 3 or 4 thousand. I forget the number exactly. But the idea is I am made up of my network. Our network makes up the friends we make, the family we have makes us up. And this is sort of a sort of a literal interpretation of that, but using thousands of little photos to make the one big image of me. So as I was quilting and making quilts, I found, particularly with the Ohio Star quilts, I had a show of them at the Urban Art Space. Shout out to those guys. And I was talking with someone who came to the show, and they said, "Your work is so beautiful." And I said, "Thanks." And I said, "It's actually it's the same algorithm that makes all my Ohio Star quilts. Once I take one picture and I know where they're going to cut, and I know I'm going to fold, and I know the mirrors, and I sort of just make it." And I was in this habit of I could take a stack of photographs because it would take hundreds of photographs in the morning, cut them all up, sew them all together, and in the evening I would unfold it, and I wouldn't know what the finished product would look like, but I would open it up and be like, "Oh, it's really neat the way the kaleidoscopes all happen." But it was sort of the same process, and I started to feel like all the thinking was done at the beginning, and then I was just sort of executing. I was just a machine that was following the directions, and I wanted to look for another approach. So I discovered improv quilting. Again, here I'm using photographs, this is sort of red photographs and stacks. These are actually strips. The white parts are strips. I went to Midwest Photo Exchange where I got all my photo prints done, shop local. And as they had a machine that would spit out prints and it would cut a little strip at the beginning and the end so you wouldn't have a little white edge. And I asked them if I could take those. Because they were just going to waste. And I'd sew them together, and you can see little edges of little people's photos, and I don't know what they are. And I found that really fascinating. So this is these red photos and these white photos. So the idea of improvisational quilting is, as many of you maybe know who are watching, is not about plan a block, plan how much you need, and execute, which is what I had been doing. It's more about take the things you have, put them together, see what works, and sort of make it up as you go. And the thing I really like about improvisational quilting is it requires you to uh, constantly make choices. It's actually, honestly, something I have trouble with sometimes. Sometimes I get really indecisive and overwhelmed by decision making. So this is sort of maybe therapeutic in a way. But so improvisational quilting, you sort of start putting stuff on the wall, you start arranging things, and you go, "Oh, does it work? Yes or no?" And you have to decide. And then you might go, "Oh, this is too much red. I need more white," or "This is too much white and I need more red," or "I need a shape," or "I need a thing," and I found it sort of liberating in a way of instead of making all the decisions up front and then executing, you're making decisions constantly. I felt sort of more involved. So this was one of the first improvisational photo quilts I made. Here's another one. This is photographs of hot rods at a car show at the Ohio State Fair. So I was going around taking pictures of the roofs and the hoods, and the light was shining on them. And then the light blue is just pictures of the sky. And then depending on what day or which way you're pointing, the sky is lighter or darker. And I cut out squares and squares and squares and squares and squares and squares. And again, assembled them in ways that sort of looked right and felt right to me in sort of this rainbow circle-y effect. So improvisational quilting, just sort of making the choices and tweaking and making it all fit together in my vision in a way that looks good to me. So I was really enjoying that process. I also um, never left fabric behind. I sort of had this idea of 10 shirts, one quilt, and it was sort of a hashtag. I put it out there, and ones of people interacted with this hashtag on the internet. So I felt pretty enthusiastic about it. But the idea was kind of a traditional quilting bee, but each person that would be invited to go first to a thrift store, find some shirts or other source of fabric, but we focused on shirts. And then we would bring them together, we'd cut them up and improvisationally put them together into a quilt. on that day. So very improvisational in that there's no planning, there's no coordination of colors even. It's just bring what you got. This was the result of the second one I did. So quilting bees are maybe not that revolutionary in a way, but um, this was a way for me that would fit into the improvisational quilting paradigm, and also a way to involve more people, which felt meaningful to me. Also going to a thrift store and thrifting the fabric, where often to buy the fabric, you're contributing to a charity or an organization that is running thrift stores and using that money to benefit the community. And it was a very locally sourced thing, which I really liked. And so that was something I was really interested in exploring as well. This a couple colleagues of mine from school. We got together and put this together, and I really like it. Somebody who'd never almost never run a sewing machine before, and we just got together and made a thing, which was really empowering. And around this time, the pandemic hit. I don't know if you guys heard about it. It was kind of a big deal. Um, but yeah, it sort of put a freeze on everything for me and probably everyone else. And this, I guess, looking back, which is what I do, had a big effect on my art making process as well. And so one of the things I did was I was sitting in my basement studio teaching first graders on Zoom in French because I was in a French immersion school. And my partner had quit her job to start a new consulting group, which was a really retrospectively bad time to do it right before a global pandemic, but we didn't see it coming. So anyway, it was a very stressful, crazy time for everyone. And I looked across my studio at my 3D printer and I was like, huh, I wonder how that works. And so I just started pulling out the files and looking at the code, and it's basically a series of XY coordinates. So X was this direction, Y is this direction, and then Z or Z is up off the paper or up off the base. And so you can see in the top left corner of this image, I just used rubber bands and stuck a pen on it. And I was like, hey, can I make it move X, Y, and Z? And I was drawing little squares and shapes. And then I started learning enough code to generate a series of X's and Y's and Z's to move around. So you can see here this image on the right. It's one of my simpler kind of just explorations, but it's sort of a square that gets smaller and smaller and smaller by like a millimeter each time and goes in. And so instead of me going, do an X line of 10 and then an X line of 9 and an X line of 8, I would write little loops where it would be X and then subtract one every time and just loop, 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 loop. So I was exploring, sitting in the basement doing that. My family wondered where I was, and I appreciate their support. That's kind of how I got through it. But this led to some other things that I started exploring with the pandemic. So one thing was back to this idea of thrifting for fabric, making fabric quilts, but again, thinking very locally. The supply chain, we all learned the word supply chain because you couldn't order things as easily, or we couldn't go out shopping because, we were social distancing and things. So I got back into the idea of thrifting fabric and thinking very locally. And I happened upon this idea of suburban terroir, meaning what is available to me in this suburb where I live. Terroir is a word often used to describe like French wines. And the reason one French wine is different is because it was grown at the top of the mountain instead of the bottom, or over here where the soil has more clay or chalk or whatever. And so the idea is that the local region has a really big effect on the resulting output, right? And so again, choice was always a challenge for me. And so by restricting the choice, instead of going to a fabric store, uh, and I could pick any color of the rainbow, and I have 4 different variations and 10 different patterns, I restricted myself to just what was at the thrift store. And if I wanted blue, this might be all the blue I get, and I have to work with that. And I found that restriction very, very interesting challenge. And I also found that it was a really local thing. And again, the thrift shop I was going to is a charitable organization, which felt great. Great. It checked a number of boxes for me in that way. But if I didn't have enough blues or I wanted more variation, I had to figure out how to do that. So I started making my own dyes. So these are some black walnuts that I collected in my backyard and around my neighborhood. Sometimes friends would contribute. If you have a neighbor or a friend with a black walnut tree that just drops these little nuts all over the ground, they are happy to have you pick them up for them before they mow their lawn because they're sick of doing it. So it's a great resource. But if you boil the husks of the black walnut, they make this really rich black not black, chocolatey brown dye. If you mix it with iron oxide, it gets very black. So I started putting old rusty screws in with things, and they make black marks where the brown dye went over. It's a really fascinating process. Um, I also built an aquaponic farm, like you do. So this fence on the left was surrounding my backyard, and just on the other side, there's a little pond where we would raise about a dozen tilapia in the summer. We'd feed the fish. The fish would poop because that's what they do. And microbes break down the poop into nutrients for the plants, and the plants would grow. So we'd have the plants, and then the fall we would harvest the tilapia and smoke them and have a little harvest dinner, which is really nice. You can see the bees on the right loving the indigo flowers. So I grew a lot of indigo. That's what most of these plants are. And I started using the indigo to make dye as well. So here on the left, you can see some boiling indigo leaves. There's a really kind of complex chemical process that I haven't really figured out perfectly, but I did get some really nice results. So you can see on the right some of my thrifted fabric being dyed blue by the indigo. Blue jeans traditionally were originally dyed with indigo, so you can get layers of that really nice, rich kind of navy blue color. Typically, it takes multiple dips, multiple layers. Sometimes you get the greens from the chlorophyll, and it's a really fascinating process. And again, I was thinking about this suburban terroir idea of like, if we have a really sunny summer, maybe the plants grow really strong and have really strong dye. And if the summer is less sunny, maybe that affects the plants and the dye is weaker or more green or more blue. So I really liked how the fabric would be affected by my local environment, my hyper local environment, which I was really fascinated by. So all that being said, I took some of this fabric and I started looking towards quilting again. So here's an improvisational quilt that I made. I called it Forest of Whispering Speakers. If you're a Tragically Hip fan, maybe you recognize the lyric. And so this is a series of improvisational triangles. The other thing I should say about improvisational quilting, at least my approach to it, is typically, like again, instead of planning out a block and making the same block several times, I typically will pick a motif, is the word I've seen used for it. So here it's triangle on rectangle, basically is the motif. And different sizes and shapes and flavors and variations and a lot of variety, which I think is really beautiful. Um, and so you can see on the left side, these are many of my blue fabrics, and some have been dyed with indigo. So the really nice thing is I can go buy one shirt at the thrift store, cut it up, sleeves and fronts and backs, whatever. And if it's a light blue shirt, that's great. I have light blue. But then I dye it with some indigo and it gets a darker blue. And I dye it with a little more indigo and it's a darker blue. And I get two or three or four different shades. And then I throw it in the black walnuts. Maybe it turns a little bit different. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but in the center, there's a blue plaid block. And then to the right, immediate right, still in the center, there's this brown plaid that's actually the same dye. But on the right, the black walnuts have changed some of the blues to almost reds and purples. And you sort of never know what you're going to get, which I really like about this natural dye process. But the good news is, it gave me more variety and more subtle variations in color, which is what I was looking for. Um, this is another recent quilt. The motif here you can see is sort of this equals sign. In addition to the blue indigo dye, I grew some turmeric, which explains the yellow. The green is the combination of the two, so I got overlapping that way. And then the reddish pinkish colors are from a dye called madder, which is a root. So you grow the plants and you chop up the root and boil it. And then you can have combinations. So the orange is the madder and the turmeric. And so I got really kind of a rainbow of colors with things that I could grow in my backyard, which is really kind of amazing to me. I never really believed it would work at the beginning. And I started playing with the indigo and then I looked and my hands were blue for a week and I was like, oh, I guess this really is a thing. So here, the motif of the equals sign. And I really love the way this quilt turned out in terms of equal versus equality. We're not all the same. It's not cookie cutter. These improvisational quilts, again, it's a motif that changes and varies. But together, the quilt is a beautiful metaphor for people and coming together and everyone bringing your own thing and together making this beautiful whole out of our many disparate, different, uh, diverse, fantastic parts. So, I like this quilt so much. I made it again in black and blacks, off black. I again dyed thrifted fabric, and a lot of the equals signs motifs are with the dyed fabric. I really like this motif. Let's see. Here's another quilt I made. And on the left side is sort of the initial stage. You can see I made sort of 6 strips of patches of fabric, all sort of oriented differently. And then on the right, I left this, I want to include this photo as sort of a not quite finished stage so I can explain the story. I'm a teacher as well by trade. And I read this story about a teacher in Idaho, I believe, who had a sign in their classroom that said, "Everyone is welcome here." And this became controversial because in today's political climate, sometimes these things do. And I'm of the opinion that everyone is welcome here. It should not be a controversial statement in a classroom. Full stop. And there's a really rich tradition in the fiber arts of encoding messages. And I encoded a message in this quilt in that I sliced the part on the left with the horizontal stripes. I sliced it vertically. And then I moved each strip up or down by 1 bump. And I used the phrase, "everyone is welcome here," to decide whether the strip moved up or down. So if the letter is in the first half of the alphabet, E, then it goes up. And if it's in the second half of the alphabet, it goes down. So if you read it from left to right, again, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, but I'm looking at the leftmost strip on the right photo. We start with E, then the V is in the second half, so it goes down, and then E goes up, and then R, Y, O, N. Every one, that last E we go up. And so you get this sort of the rhythm of the Bargello pattern is seeded by this phrase, "everyone is welcome here." And the reason I left the unfinished photo in here is because the batting I used, the center of the quilt, was actually some t-shirts that I accumulated as a teacher. You can see at the bottom left, I was a proud member of the teachers union, the CEA. And so for this quilt, the batting is actually t-shirts from the school I worked at, which as a teacher reacting to the sentence, "everyone is welcome here," just felt important to me at the time for making that. So let's see. In addition to quilt making, as I was thinking about my 3D printer and making it draw, I also started thinking, well, if it can draw, it can certainly paint. So I taught my robot to paint. We're going to try. Justin is probably nervous right now. We're going to try a video, and I want to just sort of illustrate. It's about a 1 minute video. We might cut it short. But when I strap a paintbrush to my 3D printer and have it move in X and Y and Z axis, up and down, um, I had to think about like if you are holding a brush and you just go down, you tend to just stab and the bristles go all over. So thinking about how to tell a robot explicitly how to move a brush is actually a non-trivial task. So here's a video of how my robot paints with watercolors. Here you can see the brush coming out of the paint tray that I 3D printed. With this painting, it selects one of these 6 colors somewhat randomly, makes a little swirl to load the brush. Then the brush moves to the next place, moves down and creates a small swirl of the color, and then moves back to the water, makes some movements to clean the brush, raises up, and moves to the next color. So as I started thinking about painting and encoding and generative art I would define as art where the artist creates an algorithm or a set of rules that are followed, and the algorithm, in my case, I don't know if that's too loud. In my case, the robot which executes the algorithm or the code actually makes the piece of art. So I found this really fascinating in terms of, again, my hesitancy to make choices. I gave some of the choices to a computer in random numbers. Sometimes the color would be completely random. What color it would choose would be a number from 1 to 6, and it would randomly choose that color. In this painting, it's hard to see. I think I have another picture. Yeah. in this painting, I said, okay, you can choose any color, but it has to be either the same color as your neighbor or up or down one on the spectrum or the color palette, which creates these waves of not random choppy changes, but you can see oranges that flow into browns, and the browns, some of the browns become greens, become blues, become purples. And so there's a relationship between each dot of color. And on the right, I included a close-up just so you can see, I mean, if you love watercolor, you can sort of see um, how the water of the watercolor flows between the pigment. I think watercolor is really beautiful, even when my robot is the one doing it. Um, I was inspired a little bit by the artist Saul LeWitt, who created wall drawings, and he would create the plans for the wall drawings, but he would leave them to draftspeople. Started thinking a lot about these ideas. And in terms of choice, again, traditional quilts, I felt like I had to make all the choice up front and execute the quilt. Um, Improvisational quilting, you're making choices all the time. Here, I'm explicitly choosing which choices I want to make and which choices I want to give to a computer or a robot or a random number generator, in essence. So this is sort of a continuation of my exploration from the pandemic. You can see my robot is really good at being precise and consistent. And I actually had to work to build in uh, mistakes in a way or variation. So on the left, you can see these are a series of concentric circles. Again, relating to their neighbor, they're always bigger by one or smaller by one. And I've laid over multiple layers of colors. I'll show you detail of that in a second. On the right, concentric circles of watercolor. And here again, I said you can choose any color, uh, but you have to choose the same one or the next one. And this one is a much more Roy G. Biv kind of example where it'll start at the beginning at purple and then go blue and then green and then yellow and then red. And then it's going back to purple and blue and then back to green and then blue and it'll sort of go up and down the spectrum instead of being completely random. I also built in the variation in circle size where you can be right on top of the previous line or you can have a space or you choose randomly between. Um, and I found when I had the robot do very, very precise, consistent stuff, it was a little bit boring. And I had to build in these opportunities to have some variation and some difference. Uh, Here are a couple of compositions. Again, you can see I'm exploring imprecision and making mistakes or not following cookie cutter, which the robot is content to do, but I found it wasn't as exciting. So concentric circles and squares. So the robot is picking a random color, it's picking a random shape. Well, it's choosing from two, and it's also choosing whether to do an outline or to fill or both or neither. On the right, I explored this in even more detail, and I used a wider variety of media, including some black walnut ink for my black walnuts and different markers and pens. And some were water soluble and they get dragged around. So I'm really kind of getting messy and playing with it. But I'm trying to figure out what's the relationship between my generative art and my quilting. And part of that was spurred by a conversation I had with Margaret Wunderlich, who was opening a Chaos Contemporary Craft Gallery. And she asked me that question, like, how does it all fit together? And really spurred me thinking about it. I was just making stuff, but it was my time to look back on what I had made and try to find the common thread. So here are a couple examples of work where the generative art, the robot paintings and drawings relate to the fabric quilts. I think one of the first times I really maybe did that, I was inspired by an artist named Gustavo on Instagram. Definitely recommend you check them out. And this was a generative drawing they posted on the left side. And it's sort of these columns of chunky black marker lines. There are lines and rectangles and strips and random seaming patterns. And if you look carefully, you can sort of see waves through it. There's some sort of algorithm organizing it a little bit. And I just said, you know what? I want to make that into a fabric quilt. So on the right, you can see I'm about halfway through. I've been cutting up blocks and strips and just sewing them together and try to balance them. Again, this improvisational approach of making choices. I need more black. I need more white. I need more this. I need more that. Bigger, taller, skinnier, whatever. I'm just throwing it at the wall to see what sticks. And well, I'm pinning it to the wall, but you get what I'm saying. And so I had to sort of make choices, like how wide apart are the strips? And I was like, how about 2 fingers worth? How wide are the strips? How about my palm's width? And I had to I found myself ex articulating more explicitly the parameters of my improvisational quilt than I typically would because I was sort of thinking about it coming at it from like a computer or a robot. So here on the left is a flattering picture of me where articulating, I'm deciding like where does the top of the black strips end? And what I came to decide on was again a really human scale of like how high can I reach on my design wall? That's the top of the quilt. And then how low can I reach with my hand on my design wall when I'm standing there? That's the bottom of the quilt. So it was sort of my human scale that decided this top curve and this bottom curve, whereas in the original work it was a computer algorithm or whatever. So this idea of algorithm, I've had chats with people looking at my work like at the urban art space, and they really reacted poorly to this idea of algorithm. Like, oh no, your work is beautiful, and algorithms are computers. And I was like, well, would you rather say recipe? Would you rather say pattern? Would you rather say instructions? I mean, these are all to me synonymous. So I started really thinking about how to explicitly articulate how I was building this quilt, which led me to think, well, can I make a generative painting or drawing using using my quilt as the inspiration. So I call this quilt after Gustavo because it uses Gustavo's drawing as an inspiration. And I started making these drawings called after Gustavo because they use my after Gustavo quilt as their inspiration. So you can see on the right, I'm sorry, on the left is one of the finished pieces. And so here again, I have these columns of rectangular blocky things. But when I'm working with my robot and my computer, I have to be very, very explicit in terms of how many millimeters wide is it going to be. And then I have to decide, do I allow the robot to vary that or not? So in the case of width, I kept the columns fairly consistent. But in terms of height, what I did for my little blocks was I coded 15 or 20 different options. And you might see some of these come in. So there's like the letter three, the number three, the letter E. I was trying to say both things. Could be an S, could be a rectangle, could be a C, could be a U, could be. And I gave it parameters for the maximum height and the minimum height. And I also did generate a, a code to articulate this curve at the top and bottom. So I had to be really, really explicit with how to tell a robot to do this thing that I did very naturally on the wall just by sticking pins in fabric, right? So it was a really fun way to think about how explicit we have to define the parameters when we're working with dumb computers versus when a smart person, a human brain, you can just say, oh, don't make it too big. And you're like, oh, I get that. Um, Here's another example of how I built up the layers for one of the after Gustavo drawings. In this case, I started with yellow. I had to draw a layer of orange, I believe, and you can sort of see some of the shapes, the O's, the U's, the S's, what have you. And you can see how much they vary in height as well. A layer of magenta, it looks like. A layer of teal or green, navy, and finally some purple over top. And I really here interestingly, the robot is doing its thing very precisely, but I'm using this sort of gut feel of like, I need more, I need more, I need more. I don't want to go too far. And I'm trying to sort of balance. And there's no, I don't think, an explicit way to articulate like, that's too much. Stop there. It's really a gut feeling. So again, the contrast of explicitly articulating parameters versus like, that just feels right. I find really interesting. There's a lot of AI and people are turning more and more decisions over to computers. And I think it's really important that we think critically about what are the parameters, what is okay to give up actively choosing, and what is not okay, and something that we have to, as human beings, maintain control over the decision making for. Uh, I hope that made sense. So here's a close up of this one, and again, some of the variation. If I'm articulating the drawing in X and Y axes to make the shapes, sometimes I'll have it come off the paper a little bit and it'll sort of scumble along and make these broken lines. Or sometimes just if the computer gets saturated with ink and starts to sort of buckle a little bit, it'll go kind of along the tops of the folds of the paper. And I get really interesting effects with my digital art because it's being made or executed in a physical space where paper has dimension and moves around. So I really love this interplay of the physical and the digital, or maybe physical manifestations of the digital, I find really fascinating. So that's after Gustavo on the left and after Gustavo on the right. And I think you can sort of see the relationship between them, the columns of blocky things. On the left, it's upcycled and dyed fabrics in whites and off-whites and blacks and off-blacks. And on the right, it's multiple layers ink, but I think you can see the family resemblance. One more, I think I have one more I want to share. This is sort of an active project in the works. I've been exploring this traditional quilt block called Monkey Wrench. It has another name too, which I forget off the top of my head. You can maybe see them best on the right side, the blue shapes. It's again a 9 patch, so a 3 by 3 grid. The corners are all half square triangles, so half the square is white, half the square is red, and then surrounded by these sort of rectangles that connect them. And so I programmed my robot to draw monkey wrenches, but I also gave it some choice in how to articulate them and how much freedom to vary the lines. So you can see on the left side, this is one of the initial drawings. I didn't have the horizontal and vertical lines, but I was doing these triangles that were connected, and I get to iterate, which is really fun. Like I get to say, try it once, see how it works, try it again, and I can adjust the parameters. So I can say you can have 1 millimeter of variation, or 2 millimeters, or 3 millimeters, or what have you. In the center drawing, this is multiple layers again, and the I use different markers. The lighter markers have the most variation, and then the medium markers have less, and the darker ones have still less, and then the top layer is in black and it's no variation. It's very regular. And I like how it looks like the computer was sort of trying to sketch it out and figure it out. My computer and my robot are very dumb. They do what I tell them to do, and they don't think outside the lines exactly. But I like how it looks like it's sort of figuring it out and thinking, which it's really not. It's really easy to simulate thinking. Don't be fooled. And so how's this translating into fabric? Great question. I've been making monkey wrench quilt blocks out of upcycled fabric. These are actually shirts that my cousin gave me. They were my uncle's shirts, who passed a couple of years ago. And my cousin said, "Hey, can you make a quilt with Uncle Steve's shirts?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And he was always sort of a family mechanic. He changed my mom's oil and showed me how to turn a wrench a little bit. So it's sort of a tribute to him. It got me thinking about the monkey wrenches. But so these quilt blocks are very improvisational and kind of wonky in a way. I've been again, instead of with a computer where I can articulate 1 to 3 millimeters of variation, here I can sort of say, well, about yay by yay is good, and sort of it's a lot more organic and a lot more implicit. How much is too much and how much is less? So I've been really trying to balance the here's what I let the computer choose versus here's what I let myself choose and what looks good and what doesn't, and just sort of iterating and making multiples of the same motif over and over and over. So that's how um, all of these different influences and styles of art and ways of thinking about art have been influencing my fabric quilting. I would encourage any quilters out there to look into generative artists, lots to follow on Instagram, for example. And if you haven't explored improvisational quilting, if you haven't done it before, it'll really rattle your brain and make you think about quilting in a different way, which I think is really interesting for the brain muscle. Um, I think that's all I have. I appreciate you listening and uh, taking a look at my art, and I'd be happy if there are questions to answer them now.
There are questions, Chris. Thank you so much for your time
Great.
this morning. We really appreciate it. It was really
Thank you.
interesting talk. I know that just hearing you speak about your process, your work, it's so wide ranging too. You've really, gone through different stages as an artist. And I think it's interesting that it really speaks to the tension a lot of artists face too, where you have, a recursive process or something that's more repetitive or predictable, and the tension that exists between that and then improv or being spontaneous. The way you impose limitations on yourself and restrictions on yourself, and then kind of liberate yourself from them through things like using random numbers in your algorithm to program it. It just is so interesting to me that you find ways to resolve that tension or reconcile it, and then the evidence is in your work. So that's
Thank you.
that's my light take on on how you go about your process. It's really interesting. So we definitely have some questions, and I want to get to those first. Let's
Thanks.
start with a question about your natural dyes. Can you tell us how you set the natural dye color to prevent it from fading?
Yeah, I don't know that I do, honestly. I Yeah, I guess maybe I sort of use a suburban terroir as an excuse to like do things and see how they turn out and what happens. I'm a little bit lackadaisical about it. Um, I read up and I try to follow best practices. I'm not super consistent. I do think a lot of the natural dyes might not be super light fast, and so that's something you need to be aware of. They do tend to be color fast in terms of you wash them and they're okay. And I do wash the fabric so they don't run and what have you. But I don't think it's something I've confidently resolved and I can say it always works this way. For example, if you follow me on Instagram, and just a quick plug to say that's the best place to reach me if you want to reach out, message me on Instagram, um, or reach out to Chaos Contemporary Craft for more information about my work. But on Instagram, I posted recently about ice dyeing and snow dyeing. I recently moved to Stratford, Ontario, and we have a ton of snow. And I see it as a really natural resource. So ice dyeing is a way where you put dye powders and ice on top, and as the ice melts, it sort of makes the choice as to where the dye goes. And I was trying that, and I found really bad results after I rinsed things out because I hadn't treated the fabric very well beforehand. So I would say this: black walnut dyes, like super robust. You can pick up the walnuts in your yard, and you will have black walnut dye on you. So I feel pretty confident about that one. Same with the indigo. The turmeric I've heard is not light fast as well, uh, not as light fast. So it's sort of an ongoing issue. I think these dyes, you have to be a little bit careful with some of them. I feel really confident with the black walnut, though. You can't get that out of anything. So that's my non-answer. Sorry.
That helps. Thank you, Chris. And speaking of the dyes, what color did the root plant yield?
Oh, madder. Got that
Yeah.
really nice kind of salmony pink
Yep.
color. You don't have to grow madder yourself. The plants have to be about 3 years old to get color out of the roots, so it's a commitment. You can buy madder root at any sort of dye purveyor of dye products and boil your own that way. But yeah, it gives it a really nice salmony, pinky, reddish color. Yeah,
Very good. Thinking now about the fabrics you use and the choices you've made there, especially when you're thrifting, have you found certain fabrics to be really challenging to work with, where the texture's not reacting the way you'd hoped for? If so, which ones are those? Which ones are your nemesis when it comes time to quilt?
it's a great question. I generally try to work with cotton, 100% cotton fabrics. I think environmentally, I feel better about it than synthetic or plasticky polymer type fabrics. Also, natural fibers take dye much better. You can't really dye polyester with natural dyes, so cotton works best. You can see behind me some of my fabric stash. It's literally stashed in the wall behind me. So, for example, my Uncle Steve shirts, some of them are blends. They're not all cotton, but that's sort of a special case. Also, if I am wearing a shirt, I kind of only wear thrifted shirts now, and I wear them till and I when I get them, I'm like, this is gonna be a quilt someday, but it's such a nice shirt and it fits. Not today. And I wear them for 5 years and then they wear out and then they become quilts. So I am sort of making my meaningful fabrics on my own. It's a very slow process. But to answer your question, stretchy fabrics are problematic, but it tends to be the artificial polymers that allow for the stretchiness, whereas cotton fabrics tend to be very consistent and stable and easier to sew for that reason. So I would recommend all cotton all the way.
Very good. Um, Question, this kind of retraces one of your artworks. Could you talk to us again about how to read the quilt, how everyone is welcome here? I
Sure.
know it's kind of encoded with shifting, right? The letters will shift your pattern or your
Right, right,
pieces of
right.
fabric.
Yeah, I did sort of gloss over that a little bit quickly. So to re-explain, um, so there are horizontal bands, which were in the image, and then I cut them vertically. And so each strip that I cut moves up or down. And if the next letter in the phrase is in the first half of the alphabet, I move the band up. And if it's in the second half of the alphabet, I move it down. So the key phrase I used to seed or to base the movement off of was everyone is welcome here. So E is the first letter, and I just had the first strip. It's not really moved, it's just there. So then V is the next letter. So V is obviously in the second half of the alphabet. So I moved the next notch down, the next strip down one because V is second half. EVE E is in the first half of the alphabet. So if you read it from left to right, you'll notice the E is here, the V goes down, then the E goes up. So there's E, V, E. Then R, Y, O, N are in the second half of the alphabet. So it starts high, goes down, E, V, E, R, Y, O, N. And from left to right, it goes down. Now, cameras, I'm not sure which is left to right, so I apologize. So E, V, E, R, Y, O, N, E, I, for is, S, W, W for welcome, E, L, C, O. And so each letter, first half of the alphabet, it's going to go up. Second half of the alphabet, it's going to go down. So it's really only a binary choice, up or down. And I've cut it between the M and the N in the alphabet. So you couldn't read it and crack the code and get what it is. But if you know the phrase "everyone is welcome here," then you will see, yeah, I see it in there. I see you. It's not explicit in your face. Here are the letters. But if you know the phrase, you can see, oh yeah, I see the echo of it in there because it's going up and down based on based on the letters. Does that make more sense, Justin?
It does make more sense. And your explanation was actually really musical this time. It reminded me of notes going up and down
Yeah,
on a
I found
piano.
that that does help. I'm not a great singer, but if I do go up and go down, then it helps. Yeah.
Very good. I believe those are all the questions we had today from our audience. So thank you so much for sharing those questions with us. And Chris, thank you again for the generosity of your time, your talent, and your talk here today. Special thanks also to Margaret Wunderlich at Chaos Contemporary Craft for their partnership today and their gallery representation of Chris. You can find them at 78 North High Street in downtown Columbus. That is right down the street from us here at the Rife Gallery at 77 South High Street. So just got to jump across Broad Street in downtown Columbus. Margaret also notes that Equality, one of the quilts which Chris created and referenced here today, is currently on display there. So give them a visit and check them out, and check us out too. Again, so thank you all for joining us today for this artist talk by artist Chris Mercerhill as part of our programming for Quilt National 2025, the best in contemporary quilts. I'd also like to give a special thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio Legislature, and the governor who all support the OAC and this great space. And of course, thank you to our artists in Ohio here as well. It's a great community. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.